The civil rights movement was a social movement sparked in the mid-20th century in response to the institutional segregational practices and discrimination that stigmatized colored people from the whites. The civil rights movement grew in an increasingly direct confrontational effort that illustrated the structural strain in American society as a result of the frustration from persistent suppression, desegregation, indifference, and the increasing involvement of younger people and student strata of the African American society. The movement that would come to define the social and political climate in the 1950s and 1960s culminated into what would become the civil rights movement. The divide after the Civil War, in which former slaves would be integrated into citizenry, had been left 100 years later and still unresolved. For much of the post-war era until the mid-20th century, many states and cities in the nation had enacted the Jim Crow laws and ordinances that systematically degraded the stature of African American citizens as second-class citizens. Here we find the first sociologist, Doug McAdam's classical explanatory model in which he outlined the causal structure of a civil rights conflict. He first establishes the notion of structural strain, the way in saying that the basic framework of a social order is out of joint, and thus a group or groups within society feel threatened or disconnected. One example of the structural strain that McAdam identifies is the desegregation of stature of the blacks found on page 366, whereas when a white person walking down the street had to be dressed as Mr., Mrs., or Miss, whites, on the other hand, called blacks by their names or simply as boy, an indicative aspect of the whites would employ as means of asserting their continual superiority. As a result, the civil disobedience and heated confrontation became central to the demonstrations of this movement, and as a societal structural strain persists as the biggest factor that evokes the sentiments, disdain, and the resentment. In understanding the basis of the structural strain, McAdam establishes the next step of the causal progression of the civil rights movement, the disruptive psychological state. In this sense, the organizations and individuals alike who found themselves to feel disenfranchised and powerless found the need to react. Moreover, the psychological state creates a premise for the response to the daily effects of oppression in their homes and in their communities where segregation was prevalently exercised. The Greensboro sit-ins demonstrate a prominent example of the disruptive psychological state, when the four men felt victimized and infringed upon by not being serviced at the Woolworth store. In the article, Sitting In by authors Davison and Little include the idea that, quote, just as the students were beginning to doubt their decision to sit in, an elderly white woman approached. Boys, I'm just so proud of you, she said. My only regret is that you didn't do this 10 or 15 years ago, indicating that he sent a justification within their own mind to commit to their protest against what they felt was unjust and discriminatory. The last and explanatory model that sociologist Doug McAdam notes is the social movement itself, the result of the previous conclamations, the structural strain and disruptive psychological state experienced by blacks for much of the 20th century in mainstream America. In the article, the authors point out the civil rights movement and, quote, certainly the chain of events following the Greensboro protests redirected the civil rights movement into a more confrontational phase in which the younger and especially students took the lead. In illustrating the radical efforts brought up on by the younger generations that further propelled the civil rights movement into a new front which potentially advanced the legislation and combated indifference. With the efforts against the civil injustice brought on by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the Congress for Radical Equality, and the formation of Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, the civil rights movement pursued affirmative action, as the authors point out that the NSCC leaders saw the March on Washington scheduled for August 1963 not as an opportunity to support the Kennedy bill, but as a chance to criticize the Justice Department. An indication of the active student and younger people's commitment to the cause of furthering the civil rights equality agenda in a way that can be considered more vocal than their traditional counterparts.